let's stick with that topic, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by the host of the Socialist program here on Breakthrough News, Brian Becker. Brian, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
Well, great to have you. And, in a way, because of everything that's happening in West Asia, I feel Ukraine has kind of fallen out of the news a little bit, although there's obviously still a lot going on there. And so while it's been going on for so long, I want to start with maybe what seems like a basic question is, what is this war really about? I mean, we're pouring almost $100 billion. I mean, innumerable numbers of people on both sides are dying. It's such a huge conflict, but I feel that there's always sort of a murkiness. It's like freedom, good. It's just generally good. But I mean, how did we get here? What is this conflict really about?
Yeah, well, just very quickly, and for people who might have been tuning in for the first time and not really hearing the history, because I know both of you have covered the history somewhat in the past, or extensively, in fact, the U.S. Orchestrated a coup d'etat with armed fascist militias against a democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, in February 2014. And the government that was overthrown had pledged that Ukraine would be neutral, that they would not join NATO, that Ukraine would be a neutral country and have good relations with Russia and good relations with the West, meaning Europe, NATO, and the United States. And the U.S. toppled that government. Victoria Nuland, who had been Hillary Clinton's spokesperson when she became Secretary of State, was actually in downtown Kiev helping to organize the protests. So was John McCain from the Republican Party. There was an agreement signed between the Yanukovych government and the protesters, and Yanukovych said, okay, we're going to withdraw the police from Maidan. We're going to try to we're going to meet you halfway. We're going to have early elections. We're going to decentralize power. Let's try to find a way to end this stalemate, because the protests have been going on for months. The next day after they withdrew the police, the U.S. supported fascist militias, and I'm using that language accurately and precisely, not rhetorically or with any embellishment. Those fascist forces stormed the parliament. The president fled for his life. And that began a process whereby the Ukrainian government was essentially captured by the United States. And Ukraine was going to be moved into NATO. And then Russia would have Ukraine in NATO and all of the advanced missiles, including nuclear missiles, as you talked about just now, the two of you, about the danger of a new generation of nuclear weapons. They were going to be positioned on Russia's very long border with Ukraine. And those missiles had a flight time of 6 minutes to their target, meaning missiles that Russia could never defend against. So if you think this movie started on February 2022, when Russia actually invaded, and ignore what happened in February 2014, you're coming in at the end of the movie. And for anybody who comes in at the end of the movie, you don't know the plot. You have to go back to the origin of the story. And so we see this machination by the United States to carry out regime change in Ukraine, which was the second largest republic in the Soviet Union, a sister republic for Russia, a country where most of the people spoke Russian, a country where Kiev was at one time the capital of Russia. That was the old imperial Russia. In other words, two countries that were very close. And now Ukraine became a colony, essentially, of the United States. And in 2022, Putin had said to the United States, we have a red line. We're not going to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. He amassed troops at the border in Belarus and in the Russian-Ukrainian border, 100,000 of them, and said, you better negotiate with us, to which Anthony Blinken and Biden and Jake Sullivan said, Russia's demands are non-starters. So Russia moved in, and yes, they fired the first shot in February 22, but that wasn't the first shot. The first shot was actually February 2014. So now we have a situation where I think the big story here, Rania and Eugene, is that the Ukrainians are running out of warm bodies to send to the front. So they've expanded the conscription. They're now sending conscription gangs to basically kidnap Ukrainian men, to conscript another 160,000 people to send to the front line, because they've run out of human bodies. Hundreds of thousands of people on both sides have been killed or wounded. It's a terrible tragedy. It needs to end. It could end. And the way it could end is the United States could meet Russia halfway and say, guess what? We agree with you. Ukraine can be a neutral country. What would be wrong with that? Austria was neutral after World War II. Finland had been neutral. Other countries are neutral. The U.S. is acting like a neutral country is somehow a threat to the U.S. empire, which is, it shows the gangster-like attitude by the United States. You cannot profess neutrality. Neutrality is considered an evil deed on the part of the empire. You must pledge fidelity to the empire. And that, in essence, is what this war is about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate that you use the word gangster because I think that when we look at what the US is willing to do, I think we've learned over the last year just how depraved. I mean, not that anybody's too surprised with the depravity of the US and its proxy, Israel in the Middle East, but it's certainly really pushing the envelope beyond anything we've seen, I think, in our lifetimes, and just the level of horrific genocidal violence they're willing to inflict to basically just dominate everything. And you mentioned something about the fact that Ukrainians are running out of bullets or guns or whatever it may be, some sort of equipment, right?
Human
So I guess
bodies.
human bodies, but I actually wanted to take it to the issue of equipment as well, because the US is a very powerful force in the world and it spends an insane amount of resources. Me and Eugene were just talking about before we started this segment, the amount of resources the US spends on imperialism, on militarism. But it's not infinite. And so at some point, maybe the US isn't overstretched yet, but there's this insane war happening in Ukraine to try to bleed the Russians. There's this insane amount of resources the US is pouring into Israel to genocide Gaza and now expand its horrific atrocities into Lebanon and perhaps even Iran at some point soon, with just warships and literally like an endless supply of bombs and bullets. The US is still militarizing around the South China Sea. It's still pouring weapons into Taiwan. The US is still messing around in Latin America. I mean, I guess this is a really big question that you probably can't answer in 5 minutes, Brian, but like at what point is this empire overstretched to an extent that it would be too weak to actually get its way everywhere? Because right now it kind of feels like the US keeps getting its way and just keeps pushing the envelope and keep seeing that they can keep getting their way the more violent they are, at least in this moment in time.
Well, I'd answer it this way. I think it's overstretching the resources of the country such that the needs of working class people can't be met. But it's not overstretched from the point of view of capitalist corporations who actually are making huge amounts of money from endless war. So when you think about the spending on Ukraine, the 160 billion that has spent on Ukraine, most of that money doesn't go to Ukraine. Most of that money never leaves the United States. Those are government checks basically written to Boeing and to all of the other war contractors. So what's actually happening is, under the pretext of national defense, the capitalist government is taking taxpayers' dollars and funneling that money to capitalist corporations who have, guaranteed contracts and guaranteed profits. They don't have to compete in the capitalist marketplace. These are certain kinds of commodities that are exempt from the risk of the marketplace because the government guarantees the profit. Now, in North Carolina right now, Rania, in Asheville, one of our comrades is down. A couple of our comrades are down there doing relief for the people who got wiped out by the two hurricanes. One of them is there's a hotel that's temporarily housing 200 military veterans. These are people who have lost their homes. They don't have flood insurance. They don't have wind insurance. They're stuck in a motel for the next 6 months. There's no clean water. And at the same time that the government says it can't do anything to rescue the people in Asheville, North Carolina, it is sending $160 billion to Ukraine. Now, people might say, and some of the right-wing agitators say, well, we should spend money on people at home, not on those Ukrainians. But the money is actually not going to the Ukrainians. The money is going to the capitalist corporations that make up the military-industrial complex. In other words, rich Americans are getting this money. The Ukrainians pay a price because it's their people dying in a proxy war, And working class folks in the United States, like these 200 veterans stuck in a hotel in Asheville, they're paying the price. So the war has an enormous cost. It's overstretching the lives of the American people, the people of the United States, the working class people. I mean, the rising tide of homelessness, the fact that childhood poverty doubled again after having been reduced by 50% because of COVID emergency relief. It doubled again when the government said, well, the COVID emergency is over, so we're cutting all these aid programs to families. At the same time, they increased the US military budget by $200 billion. So the empire is overstretching the lives of the people of the United States and the people around the world. So we have to look at this from a class point of view. This is a rich man's war in Ukraine. It's a rich man's war in Palestine. The US ruling class, as you said, they use Israel as a proxy. But all those bombs, those 2,000-pound bombs, that's good business for American bomb makers. You know, they bombed 10 cities in Gaza. Well, that's good business because now Israel can order more bombs and American taxpayers can pay for those bombs. So we're in a class we have to look at war and empire and imperialism from the framework of class. And by that I mean that the imperialists represent a class, the capitalist class in the Western countries that are making huge profits from endless war, occupation, and looting and plundering other people's labor and resources. And the people who pay the price first and foremost are the victims, mainly in the global South, but also U.S. working class folks who are told by the U.S. government, sorry, we just don't have the resources to bail you out. And that's the reality of the current situation. I wanted to make one more comment if I could.
Please.
If it's all right. You know, I watched your amazing segment right before this with Jamie from Nota Toll. You know, isn't it something that if it's true that thousands of North Korean troops are poised to fight with Russia? When you think back to 1950 and the Korean War, it was a marker where all the countries that supported North Korea were Russia, China, the East European socialist governments, and then on the other side were all the imperialists. And even though the fight now between Russia and Ukraine is not about communism and socialism, because the Soviet Union was destroyed and the Communist Party that existed in both Ukraine and Russia, unified Communist Party, that's been destroyed. Even though that's gone, the imperialist drive for super profits just is endless. So in a way, the Cold War masked this war, this imperialist war drive with ideology, the fight against communism, when in fact, even when the communist issue isn't really the pressing topic, you still have the same dynamic war drive. It's a class war by imperialism, and it's been a class war for decades. And that's why working people in the United States have to say no. Trump, Harris, no. The war drive, no. International solidarity, that's what we have to be fighting for.
No, I think it's a tremendously good point. They said we were going to get a peace dividend when the Cold War ended, and instead we got the exact opposite under President Bill Clinton. Well, as always, Brian, really appreciate you having the opportunity or being willing to join us here on the freedom side. Everyone should be checking out the Socialist program. Yesterday's episode was pretty good. I'll let you see who was on the show with Brian, but might be worth it.
We had an amazing guest.
I think so. I think it'd be worth it checking it out after this show. Check it out, Socialist program.
I've heard of him before. Name starts with an E.
Well, anyway, the topic of the show is what will happen if Trump wins. And I think it's a really important assessment. And Eugene Puryear, so it's not an inside joke, Eugene was actually our guest. And it's really an amazing interview with tremendous historical perspective and insight. I hope people get a chance to watch it.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you for having me on. And every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the Socialist program. Brian Becker, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be here. Thank you.